So there's this moment that keeps me up at night. It happened over 100 years ago in Mexico, but when you hear what went down, you realize some stories just don't fit into neat boxes. Some stories break the rules of what's possible. Picture this. 1915. A young guy. Name was Wenseslao Moguel. He was maybe 24, 25 years old. Not special in any obvious way. Just a kid caught up in the Mexican Revolution, fighting for what he believed in. And then one day, everything stopped. The government caught him. They said he was a deserter. They didn't debate it. They didn't have a trial that lasted more than a few minutes. They just gave him a sentence that should have ended his story right there. Death by firing squad, dawn execution, standard procedure for the time. Here's where I have to stop and ask you something. Have you ever thought about what it would actually feel like? Not the romantic version from movies. The actual moment, when you know it's happening, when you can see the people with guns, when you understand that in the next minute or two, you're just going to be gone. Not sleeping, not unconscious, just gone. The people around you will move on. Your family won't see you again. Your dreams, your plans, everything you thought your life was going to be, it all stops. That's what Wenceslao would have felt that morning. That clarity, that finality. But here's the thing nobody expected. He survived. Not just barely, not like he escaped or the guns jammed or some lucky accident happened. No, he actually got shot. 9 times. Full automatic fire, rounds tearing through his body. And then, like that wasn't enough, they walked up to him, lying on the ground, bleeding out. And one of the officers put a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger. Shot him point blank, between the eye and the ear, execution style. They checked the body. They were absolutely certain he was dead. And then they left. Except he wasn't dead. A few hours later, in the dark, this guy woke up. I'm not talking about some Hollywood moment where he opens his eyes and sits up slowly. I'm talking about a person covered in bullet wounds, bleeding from 9 entry and exit wounds, with a through and through hole in his skull, somehow regaining consciousness in a pile of corpses. And that's not even the craziest part of what happened next. So I need to back up a little bit and actually explain who Wenceslao was, because this isn't just some random survival story. This is specifically about a person in a specific moment in history, and understanding the why makes the how even more insane. Mexico in 1915 was essentially a war zone. The Mexican Revolution had been tearing the country apart for about 5 years at that point. You had different factions fighting for control, different ideas about what the country should become, and like every revolution, the regular people caught in the middle got the worst of it. Pancho Villa was leading one of the most powerful armies, and he had supporters, people who believed in what he stood for. Wenceslao was one of those people. He wasn't a military strategist, he wasn't a general planning campaigns. He was just a young guy who saw something wrong and decided to do something about it. He joined up with the revolutionary forces. The thing about revolutions is that they don't care about your individual story. They don't care that you had hopes, or a family waiting for you, or dreams about what you wanted to accomplish. You're just another person in the machinery. And when that machinery starts grinding against you, it grinds hard. Wenceslao made a choice at some point that cost him everything. Or so it seemed. Historians aren't entirely clear on the exact details, but the official charge was desertion. He left his unit. Maybe he wanted to go home. Maybe he was scared. Maybe there's a more complicated story we'll never fully know. But whatever the reason, he got caught by federal forces loyal to the government, the forces fighting against Villa's revolution. The government wasn't interested in rehabilitation. They weren't thinking about second chances. What they were thinking was simple. You joined the enemy, you betrayed the nation, and now you're going to face the consequences. That consequence was a firing squad. I want you to understand the timeline here because it matters for what comes next. He gets arrested. He gets a quick military trial, basically a formality where they confirm what they already decided. He gets the death sentence. He probably spends a night in a cell, knowing what's coming. Maybe he sleeps. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he thinks about his family, or writes a letter he'll never send, or sits in silence. We don't know those details. but what we do know is that he faced that night. And then morning came. They would have woken him before dawn. That's how these things worked. The execution was scheduled for a specific time, and they had to get him prepared. Prepared. There's a weird word choice for it, but that's what happened. They got him ready. Possibly they gave him a chance to say something, though I don't have records of what, if anything, he said. Then they took him to the execution ground. There would have been 9 soldiers, maybe more, all with rifles. There would have been an officer in charge, probably someone who'd done this before, who knew the routine. Wenseslao would have been placed against a wall or a post. They would have asked if he had any final words. The ceremony of death, even in its brutal efficiency, had a certain ritual to it. And then the command came. The soldiers raised their weapons. 9 guns pointed at one person. Wenseslao Moguel. Aim. Fire. The thing about automatic weapons is that they don't miss gently. When a full military rifle fires at close range into a person's body, you're not getting some clean, quick exit. You're getting catastrophic damage. The bullets tore through his chest, his abdomen, his lungs. Multiple rounds entered his body and didn't come clean. This was meant to be thorough. This was meant to be final. He fell. He was bleeding heavily, in shock, barely conscious if conscious at all. By any medical standard, he was already dead. The human body loses consciousness at about a pint of blood loss, and he'd already lost much more than that. But the military officer in charge wasn't satisfied. Maybe he wasn't certain. Maybe it was just protocol. So he walked over to Wenceslao's body, lying on the ground, and pressed the barrel of his pistol right up against his head, between his eye socket and his ear. In that moment, the officer was absolutely sure that one more shot would finish it, would erase any possibility of survival. He pulled the trigger. The bullet entered at that precise point, between the eye and the ear, and traveled through his skull. When a bullet enters the human head at point-blank range, the damage is instantaneous and complete. Brain tissue doesn't survive that trauma. Neurological function stops. Everything stops. The officer must have looked at that and been satisfied. Body confirmed dead. Mission accomplished. And with that, the execution team left. They walked away, probably back to their post, probably to have breakfast, probably to move on to whatever came next in their day. They didn't look back. There was no reason to. The person they'd come to execute was gone. Except. And here's the part that makes you question everything you think you know about human biology and survival. He wasn't dead. Hours passed. Maybe 3 hours, maybe 4. The sun came up. The temperature started to rise. And in that exposed place where they'd left the bodies, the young man with 9 bullet wounds and a hole in his head regained consciousness. Try to put yourself in that moment for a second. You're lying on the ground. You can't immediately remember where you are or what happened. But then you do remember. You remember the guns. You remember the sound. You remember everything. And now you're awake, and your body is screaming at you. Every cell that hasn't been destroyed is sending signals of pain and trauma. You're bleeding. You can't move properly. You probably can't even sit up. You're surrounded by dead bodies, and you understand with absolute clarity that by all rights, you should be one of them. You should be dead. There is no logical reason you're not dead. But you are. What do? This is where the story gets even stranger, because what Wenceslao did next was something that shouldn't have been possible. What happened was that he somehow got up. I don't mean he stood up cleanly. I mean he managed to move his broken, bleeding body from that spot. He got up. Maybe it took him minutes, maybe longer. Maybe he had to stop and rest several times. Maybe he threw up from the pain and the shock. But he got up. And then he walked. There's no other word for it. This person, shot 9 times, with a through and through bullet wound in his head, started moving. He left that execution ground. He went looking for help, for safety, for anyone who might help him survive. And here's the almost unbelievable part. The people who found him, who helped him, were locals. They were ordinary people living in that area. They could have turned him in. They probably would have faced consequences if the government found out they'd harbored a deserter. But they didn't. They saw a young man who'd been executed and somehow survived, and they chose to help him. They gave him shelter. They gave him treatment. They gave him a reason to keep fighting. Now, when I say treatment, I'm not talking about modern medicine. This was 1915 Mexico. There weren't hospitals easily accessible. There weren't antibiotics. There weren't machines to monitor vital functions. It was basic care. Bandages made from whatever they had. Possibly some traditional remedies. A place to lie down. Food and water when his body could accept it. That's what kept him alive. That and his own will to live, which at that point must have been the most powerful force in his entire body. The wounds healed. Not easily, not without complications, but they healed. The bullet through his skull, and this is where medicine gets absolutely fascinating, didn't destroy the parts of his brain that would have killed him. By pure chance, absolute chance, the bullet's trajectory avoided major neural structures. It didn't hit the motor cortex. It didn't hit the areas that would stop his breathing or his heartbeat. It passed through at an angle that, while catastrophic by normal standards, wasn't immediately fatal. It left a scar, literal and permanent, but it left him alive. Over weeks and then months, Wenceslao recovered. The bullet wounds sealed up. The bleeding stopped. The infection that easily could have killed him didn't. And slowly he came back from the edge of death. Not without consequences. Not without permanent damage. The scars never went away. There's a visible hole, a scar, in his skull for the rest of his life. But he came back. He was alive. He had survived something that was statistically impossible to survive. 9 bullets to the body. 1 bullet to the head at point-blank range. By every calculation, he should have been dead by the first volley. By the second volley, definitely dead. By the final execution shot, not just dead, but extremely dead. But he wasn't. And that's where this story takes another turn. Because now we're not just talking about a historical curiosity or a medical oddity. We're talking about what happens after. We're talking about a man living with this impossible thing that happened to him. How do you live with that? How do you wake up every day knowing that the government tried to erase you and failed? How do you function in a world that has already decided you should be dead? Wenceslao had to figure that out. And for years, probably decades, he did it quietly. The Mexican Revolution eventually ended. New governments came in. The chaos settled. Wenceslao lived his life. He built something. He existed in a world that had tried to eliminate him and succeeded only in making him the most improbable survivor in recorded history. But then, in the 1930s, something happened that would change how the world saw his story. There was a man named Robert Ripley who had created something called Ripley's Believe It or Not. It was a collection of the world's most unusual and impossible things. Verified oddities, strange facts, extreme human experiences, and somehow, and I want you to think about how this happened, how this information spread in the pre-internet age. Ripley's people learned about Wenceslao. They learned about the man who'd survived a firing squad, and they wanted to verify it. They wanted to document it. They wanted to show it to the world. By 1937, Wenseslao Moguel became a public figure. He was brought to Ripley's Believe It or Not exhibitions. He showed his scars to audiences. He showed the visible mark on his skull where the bullet had entered. And people saw him, and they understood that this wasn't a legend. This wasn't a story. This was a real human being who stood in front of them with the physical proof of something that should have been impossible. The reaction was what you'd expect: disbelief, amazement, wonder. Thousands of people came to see this man and his scars. Thousands of people confirmed what they already suspected: that the human body and the human will to live are capable of things that defy explanation. That sometimes the world is stranger than we can imagine. What most people didn't realize at the time was that having Ripley verify his story meant more than just becoming a curiosity. It meant that medical professionals had to actually look at this. Doctors examined him. They looked at the scars. They tried to understand how a person could survive what Wenceslao had survived. And what they found was honestly kind of remarkable in how specific it was. The bullet that went through his head, the one that should have been instantly fatal, had traveled at just the right angle. Not the right angle in the sense of luck, but in the sense of mathematical precision. When it entered between his eye socket and his ear, it passed through the temporal bone, which is relatively thin in that area. But here's where the survival part gets interesting. The bullet didn't hit his brainstem. It didn't damage the areas that control breathing or heart function. It didn't destroy the major blood vessels in the brain. The trajectory was such that it essentially created a wound channel through tissue that, while traumatized, could function despite the damage. Think about it this way. Your brain is divided into different functional areas. Some control movement, some handle vision, some manage speech. The motor cortex, where your brain sends signals to move your body, would have been fatal if damaged. The cerebellum, which controls balance and coordination, would have been devastating. The brainstem, which we mentioned, controls every automatic function that keeps you alive. But the bullet's path missed all of those. It went through areas that are damaged, but not immediately incompatible with survival. The human brain, despite being incredibly complex and fragile, has more redundancy than you might think. Damage one area, and other areas can sometimes compensate. What doctors were looking at was probability. The statistical likelihood of surviving a point-blank gunshot to the head is something like 1 in several thousand. The likelihood of surviving 9 additional gunshot wounds to the torso is astronomical. The likelihood of surviving all of that and then walking away, getting help, and living decades afterward, that enters into territory where you're basically looking at numbers so small they're almost theoretical. One of the doctors who examined Wenceslao in that era, looking at the scars and the trajectory, basically concluded that this was a 1 in a million case, maybe 1 in 10 million. He'd been in medicine for decades and had never seen anything like it. The precision of the angle, combined with the fact that Wenceslao's body didn't become infected despite the conditions he was treated in, combined with the fact that his brain didn't swell enough to become inoperable, all of it had to align perfectly. But here's something else that people don't often talk about when they discuss survival stories like this. The mental resilience required to survive isn't just biological, it's psychological. Wenceslao had already faced death. He'd already accepted it, in some sense, because that's what you do when you're facing a firing squad. You make peace with it. You accept that this is the end. And then it wasn't the end. And then he had to figure out how to live after that. Some people in that situation might have wanted to hide, might have wanted to disappear into obscurity and pretend none of it happened. But Wenceslao did something different. He stepped into the spotlight. He showed people his scars. He told his story. He became, in a real sense, a symbol. A symbol of something that humans needed to believe in. The possibility that you could face the worst and survive it anyway. As the years went on and Ripley's exhibitions continued, Wenceslao became something of a minor celebrity. He traveled. He gave interviews. People knew his name, and through it all, he carried those scars, visible proof of his story. The scar on his skull, which you could see if you looked closely, was basically a permanent reminder that he shouldn't be alive, that he defied biology and probability and the intentions of people trying to end his life. But he lived. He lived for decades after that firing squad. He lived through the rest of the Mexican Revolution's aftermath. He lived through the Great Depression. He lived through World War II. He lived through all the changes of the 20th century. And then, in 1976, he died of natural causes at 85 years old. A man who'd been executed by firing squad in 1915 made it almost to the last quarter of the 20th century. He lived a life that, by any measure, should never have happened. When you look at the statistics on this kind of thing, when you look at the medical literature on gunshot survivability, when you talk to trauma surgeons and neurologists, they all agree on one thing. Wenseslao Moguel should not have survived. The margin for error was 0. The probability was negligible. But he did survive. And the question that keeps coming up, the one that people have been asking for over 100 years, is why. Some people want to call it luck, and sure, luck is part of it. Blind mathematical luck, that the bullet traveled the exact path it did. But that's not the whole answer, because luck doesn't explain the will. Luck doesn't explain how a person with 9 gunshot wounds managed to stand up and walk. Luck doesn't explain how he found help, or how his body managed to heal in conditions where infection should have killed him. There's something else involved. Something about the human capacity to endure. Something about the human will to live that goes beyond what we can measure in a laboratory. Wenceslao made a choice in that moment when he woke up covered in his own blood, surrounded by death, knowing that the world had already decided he should be dead. He made a choice to keep going. And that choice, combined with the biological improbability, combined with the help of people around him, combined with decades of living, that created a story that refuses to fit into our understanding of what's possible. What's interesting is that this isn't unique to Wenceslao. Throughout history, there are people who survive things that shouldn't be survivable. There are documented cases of people surviving falls from airplanes without parachutes. There are people who've survived multiple organ failures. There are people who've beaten cancers that had survival rates measured in single-digit percentages. The human body is more resilient than we usually give it credit for, and the human mind might be even more so. Modern neuroscience has actually started to understand some of this better. We know now that the brain has something called neuroplasticity, the ability to rewire itself, to create new connections around damaged areas. We know that trauma survivors often have remarkable capabilities for recovery that seem to defy conventional medical understanding. We know that the mind and the body are more interconnected than we once thought, and that belief, will, and determination can sometimes literally reshape how the body heals. But here's what I keep coming back to with Wenceslao's story. It's not just about the biology, it's not just about the lucky angle or the neuroplasticity or the medical care he received. It's about the meaning of survival. It's about what it means to face something that should be absolute and final, and to refuse to accept it. It's about a person saying, essentially, that the world doesn't get to decide when his story ends. In 1937, when Ripley brought Wenceslao to the public eye, the world was heading toward another massive conflict. Another war was coming that would dwarf the Mexican Revolution in scale. And people were looking at this man, this physical embodiment of impossible survival, and they were finding something in him. They were finding hope. They were finding proof that things that seemed impossible could happen, that humans had capacities beyond what seemed logical or predictable. I think that's why his story endured. Not because it was unusual, though it was, but because it spoke to something fundamental about what we are. Every person who looked at Wenceslao's scars was essentially looking at a question. If this person can survive this, what does that mean for me? What does that mean about my own capacity to endure, to survive, to overcome? There's a medical term called survival bias. It refers to situations where we only hear about the successes, not the failures. For every Wenceslao who survived a firing squad, there were presumably many others who didn't. And that's true. That's worth acknowledging. Sometimes probability wins out. Sometimes people don't survive. But the fact that Wenceslao did survive, the fact that his story is so specific and so documented and so verifiable, that matters. It shifts something in how we think about possibility. In recent years, some researchers have actually tried to analyze what happened to Wenceslao using modern tools. They've looked at the trajectory that would have been necessary for him to survive. They've consulted with ballistics experts, with neurosurgeons, with trauma specialists. And the consensus is always the same. This was an exceptional case, one that shouldn't have happened but did. What I find fascinating is that Wenceslao himself, after he became famous, rarely seemed to make a huge deal about it. He didn't go around giving philosophical speeches about survival. He just showed up. He showed his scars. He let people draw their own conclusions. There's something almost modest about that response to something so extraordinary. He died in 1976, And for a while, his story faded a bit from the collective consciousness. But in recent decades, with the internet, with easier access to information, his story has been rediscovered. Medical students learn about it. Neurology professors reference it. Trauma surgeons discuss it in conferences. His story has become, in a sense, immortal in ways he probably never anticipated. What gets me about all of this is the human element that doesn't get quantified. We can measure the trajectory of a bullet. We can calculate probabilities. We can examine brain tissue and explain why certain areas survived intact. But we can't really measure the moment when Wenceslao woke up in that darkness, covered in blood, understanding that he should be dead. We can't quantify the decision he made in that moment to keep living. We can't put a number on the resilience, the courage, the sheer force of will that it took to stand up and walk away. That's the part of the story that doesn't fit neatly into medical literature or historical records. That's the part that touches something deeper in us. So let's go back to that question I asked you at the beginning. Let's actually sit with it for a moment. Wenseslao Moguel was sentenced to death. 9 soldiers fired at him at close range. An officer executed him with a pistol shot to the head. By every measure, he was dead. The people who killed him believed he was dead. The medical standard would have declared him dead. The logical conclusion was that Wenceslao Moguel was finished. But then he opened his eyes in the darkness, and he chose to live. He didn't escape to safety by some miracle of circumstance. He got up, with a bullet hole through his skull and 9 other gunshot wounds, and he walked. He found help. He let people treat him. He survived the recovery. He lived through decades that should never have existed. And then he stepped into the public eye and said, essentially, this happened, I'm here, and I'm not hiding. That's the part of this story that matters most, I think. Not that it was possible medically, though it was. Not that the probability was against it, though the probability was monumentally against it, but that a person facing absolute finality chose to push back, chose to fight, chose to live. And in doing that, he became something more than a medical curiosity. He became a reminder that we're more resilient than we think. That survival sometimes comes down to choices made in moments when everything seems lost. That the human spirit is capable of things that don't show up on any scan or test, but that absolutely matter. Wenceslao Moguel was executed by firing squad in 1915. By every reasonable measure, his story should have ended there. But it didn't. He lived for 61 years after that moment. He became famous. He had a life. And most importantly, he left us with a story that challenges how we think about possibility, about resilience, and about what it means to be human. So here's what I want to ask you, and I want you to really sit with this question because it matters. If you were standing in that darkness, covered in your own blood, knowing that the world had literally tried to execute you, and somehow you were still breathing, what would you have done? Would you have had the strength to get up? Would you have had the will to find help? Would you have been able to look at the world afterward and say, I survived? Because that's what Wenceslao did. And that's what makes his story more than just a historical oddity or a medical anomaly. It makes it a statement about the nature of human will itself. I want to know what you think about this. Seriously, drop a comment down below and tell me, what do you think was the most incredible part of his survival? Was it the biological improbability? Was it the psychological resilience? Was it the way he chose to share his story afterward? Or was it something else entirely? Because this story doesn't have just one incredible element. It's layers of incredible, and I want to hear what lands most deeply with you. And if this story did something for you, if it made you think about resilience or possibility or what you're capable of, then please hit that subscribe button. Because there are more stories like this. Stories about humans who faced the impossible and found ways through. Stories that challenge what we think we know about our own capacities and limitations. Stories that matter. Wenceslao Moguel died in 1976. But his story didn't die with him. It's here. It's real. And it's still doing what it did 100 years ago, reminding us that we're capable of more than we think.